Some nights, a father just needs one small win, Taff, one warm room, one smile from his little girl. And in the corner, a woman who came here every single week for a reason no one at that cafe ever asked about. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. He already knew today had broken something in her. One kind gesture from a stranger, and everything in that little girl's day started to shift. He brought her here to feel better. He never expected a stranger's table to change both their lives. Daniel Cole had exactly $14 in his wallet, a daughter who hadn't smiled in 6 days, and a rainstorm that refused to let up. If you've ever watched your child hurting and felt completely powerless to fix it, stay with this story until the end, because what happened in that cafe that evening is the kind of thing that restores your faith in strangers. And if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe right now, because you will not want to miss where this one goes. It was a Tuesday. The kind of gray, waterlogged Tuesday that made the whole city feel like it was holding its breath. Daniel stood outside Lily's elementary school under a cracked umbrella, watching the other children run out toward parents, holding colorful folders and homemade cards. It was the week of the school's family tree project, and every single child had brought home a creaser with 2 parents drawn at the top of the branches. Every child except Lily. She had drawn her mother's branch, then stopped, staring at the blank space beside it for so long that her teacher had gently asked if she wanted help finishing it. Lily said no. She said she'd rather leave it empty than draw someone who wasn't there anymore. Daniel's wife, Sarah, had died 2 years earlier, a sudden aneurysm on an otherwise ordinary Sunday morning. The kind of loss that arrives without any warning shot, without any chance to prepare a 7-year-old for a world that no longer made sense. Lily had been 5 then, too young to fully understand permanence, and now, at 7, she understood it painfully well. She understood it every time a classmate mentioned a mom picking them up, every time a worksheet asked her to write both parents' names, every time the world quietly reminded her that hers was smaller than everyone else's. The 2 years since had blurred together for Daniel into a single long exercise in survival. He remembered almost nothing of the first 6 months, except the paperwork, death, certificates, insurance forms, a mortgage that didn't care that his wife was gone, a job that granted him exactly 5 days of bereavement leave before expecting him back at his desk. He remembered learning, clumsily and all at once, how to braid hair that never sat straight, how to pack a lunchbox a 5-year-old wouldn't trade away, how to sit in a pediatrician's waiting room alone and answer questions meant for 2 parents. Sarah had been the one who remembered birthdays, who knew which stuffed animal Lily needed to fall asleep, who could read her daughter's silences the way other people read a book. Daniel had spent 2 years teaching himself that same fluency, one exhausted night at a time, terrified the entire way that he was getting it wrong. He had a support system, technically, his mother-in-law, Ruth, who lived 40 minutes away and helped when she could, a sister in another state who called every Sunday, a couple of co-workers who occasionally covered his shift when Lily was sick. But support systems, he had learned, could not sit beside you at 2 in the morning when grief crept back in disguised as ordinary loneliness. Most nights, after Lily was asleep, Daniel sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at nothing, doing the quiet arithmetic of a life that no longer added up the way it was supposed to. He didn't complain. He didn't really let himself grieve out loud, not in front of Lily, not in front of anyone. He simply carried it, the way he imagined every single parent eventually learned to carry the 8 parts of the job that were never meant to be done alone. That Tuesday, when Lily walked out of the building, her backpack straps drooping off her small shoulders, her eyes were red and swollen. She didn't run to him the way she usually did. She just walked, slow and small, clutching her rolled-up poster in one hand and Mr. Buttons, her graying, one-eared stuffed rabbit, in the other. When Daniel crouched to meet her at eye level, she didn't say anything. She simply held up the poster. At the top, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, it said, "My family," and beneath it was one branch. Just one. He felt something crack open in his chest. The particular ache that only fathers who have lost the mother of their child truly understand. The ache of watching your kid carry a grief that isn't fair, that she never chose, that no amount of love from you alone seems able to fully patch. Later, walking to the car, Lily's teacher had caught up with them under the awning, apologizing quietly, explaining that the assignment had been standard curriculum, that she genuinely hadn't thought about how it might land for a child in Lily's situation, that 2 other kids in class also lived with only one parent and she'd try to be more thoughtful next time. Daniel appreciated the apology, but it didn't undo the hour Lily had already spent at her desk, watching classmates fill 2 branches while she filled 1, hearing a boy 2 seats over ask, not unkindly but not gently either, why her tree only had a daddy on it. Lily hadn't answered him. She'd simply put her crayon down and folded her hands in her lap for the rest of the period. The particular stillness of a child who has decided that silence is safer than explaining something too big for words. It wasn't the first hard day, and Daniel knew, with the tired certainty of 2 years of experience, that it wouldn't be the last. Grief for a child didn't move in a straight line the way adults sometimes hoped it would. It circled back in waves. A song on the radio, a Mother's Day flyer taped to a hallway bulletin board, a stranger's perfume that smelled like the one Sarah used to wear, each wave cresting without warning and knocking the wind out of her all over again. Daniel had gotten better at recognizing the signs. He'd gotten no better at knowing exactly what to do about them. Daniel worked long shifts as a maintenance supervisor at an apartment complex across town. The kind of steady, unglamorous job that paid the bills, but left little room for anything extra. Money was tight that month, tighter than usual, after the car needed new brakes. But as he looked stay at his daughter standing in the rain, with her lonely little family tree, he made a decision that's had nothing to do with his bank balance, and everything to do with the look on her face. He wasn't going to take her straight home to sit in their quiet apartment with its quiet grief. He was going to take her somewhere warm, somewhere with lights and hot chocolate and the small, ordinary magic of being somewhere new. There was a café, 2 blocks from her school, tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of place with fogged-up windows and mismatched chairs that Daniel had walked past 100 times without ever going in. Sarah used to say it looked like the kind of place where good things happen to tired people. He'd never tested that theory. Tonight, holding his daughter's small, cold hand, he decided it was time to. The bell above the door rang softly as they stepped inside, shaking rain from the broken umbrella. The warmth hit them immediately. The smell of espresso and cinnamon, the low hum of a jazz record, string lights strung along exposed wooden beams. Lily's shoulders, which had been curled inward the entire walk, loosened just slightly. Daniel guided her to a small table near the window, the 2 of them settling into mismatched wooden chairs, rain sliding down the glass beside them in thin silver lines. The cafe itself seemed to hold a kind of unhurried peace that the rest of the city outside had forgotten how to offer. Mismatched armchairs sat in one corner beside a bookshelf stuffed with paperbacks free for port. The taking. A chalkboard behind the counter listed the day's specials, in looping handwriting, half the words smudged from being erased and rewritten so many times. A few other patrons were scattered throughout. A college student hunched over a laptop, 2 older men playing chess by the window, a barista humming along to the record spinning behind the counter. It was the kind of place that didn't ask anything of you, which was exactly, Daniel realized as he finally exhaled for what felt like the first time all day, what both of them needed. It was only after they sat down that Daniel noticed the woman at the next table. She looked to be in her mid-50s. Silver threaded gently through auburn hair, cut into a neat bob, a cream cardigan draped over her shoulders, a pair of reading glasses hanging from a thin gold chain against a strand of pearls. She sat alone, a teacup in front of her that had long gone cold, an empty chair across from her that she hadn't touched. There was something in the stillness of her posture, not lonely exactly, but practiced, like a person who had learned how to sit with an empty seat and make peace with it. She glanced over at Lily, and something shifted in her expression, not pity, but recognition. The kind of look that comes from someone who has seen a particular sadness before, up close, and knows exactly what it looks like on a child's face. Daniel ordered 2 hot chocolates, and, after a pause, a slice of chocolate cake to split between them. A small extravagance, he told himself he's dasn't it. Why not figure out how to afford later? Lily sat quietly, tracing circles on the table with her finger, not touching her drink when it arrived. She still had the rolled-up poster tucked under her arm like she couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't bear to let it go either. It was Eleanor, though Daniel didn't know her name yet, who spoke first. Her voice was soft, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't demand anything back. She asked Lily, gently, what she was drawing, nodding toward the edge of paper, peeking out from under her arm. Lily hesitated. Then, in the way that children sometimes trust strangers more easily than they trust the adults who love them most, she unrolled it and set it on the table. Eleanor looked at the single branch for a long moment. Then she reached into her handbag, pulled out a pen, and, after asking permission with her eyes, waiting for Lily's small nod, she drew something on a spare paper napkin instead of on the poster itself. It was a rabbit, quick and imperfect, but unmistakably a rabbit, with one ear slightly larger than the other, just like Mr. Button's. She slid it across the table. Every family tree, she said quietly, needs at least one silly branch. I think yours should have this one. For the first time in 6 days, Lily smiled. It was small, barely more than a twitch at the corner of her mouth, but Daniel saw it, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 6 days finally loosened. That should have been the end of it. A kind stranger. A small moment of warmth on a hard day. The kind of thing you remember fondly and never think about again. But Eleanor didn't go back to her cold tea and her silence. She asked if she could join them, and Daniel, still cautious but grateful, said yes. Over the next hour, in the way conversations unfold naturally between strangers who have accidentally found comfort in each other, Daniel learned that Eleanor came to this cafe every single Tuesday, always ordered the same table, always sat facing the door, and always left her tea to go cold, without quite noticing. She hadn't planned to explain why, but somewhere between Lily's second hot chocolate and the last bite of cake, it came out anyway. Tuesdays had been her daughter Emma's favorite day. Emma had loved this cafe. She used to say the string lights made it feel like the inside of a snow globe. Eleanor had lost her 11 years ago, in a car accident on a rain-slicked road not unlike the one outside the window right now. Emma had been 22. Emma had been studying to become a pediatric nurse, Eleanor explained. The kind of daughter who called just to say hello, who dragged her mother to this exact cafe every doors. Pekijan Lisbol Vouarge, because it was the halfway point between campus and home. They had a whole ritual. Emma always ordered a cinnamon latte, always claimed the seat facing the door, so I can see you coming, always saved her the last bite of whatever pastry they split. The Tuesday she died, Eleanor had been running 15 minutes late, held up by traffic, and Emma had texted her twice, both times ending with a small rabbit emoji, an old inside joke from childhood that Eleanor had never fully explained to anyone since, including, until this evening, a stranger's 7-year-old daughter and the drawing Eleanor hadn't planned to make. Eleanor said she still came every Tuesday, not because she expected anything to change, but because sitting in a place that remembered her daughter felt better than sitting in a house that had slowly stopped smelling like her. In the years since, her husband had passed from a long illness. Her remaining family lived scattered across the country, and Eleanor had built a life that was, by her own quiet admission, smaller than she meant it to be. A part-time job at the library 3 mornings a week, a garden she tended too carefully, and Tuesdays at this cafe, holding a cup of tea she rarely finished, facing a door that no longer had anyone coming through it for her. She admitted, quietly, that she hadn't come to look in more than a few sentences to another human being in this cafe in almost a year. Most Tuesdays, she said, people simply saw an older woman drinking alone and looked away, assuming she wanted to be left in peace. She said she'd stopped correcting that assumption a long time ago, because it was easier than explaining the truth, that peace wasn't really what she'd found in that empty chair across from her. It was just the shape grief eventually settles into when nobody's watching. Daniel understood that particular loneliness better than he wanted to admit. Since Sarah died, he had built an entire life around simply getting through each day. Work, pickup, dinner, homework, bed, repeat, without ever really processing what had happened to him, because there was no time, no space, and honestly no energy left over for his own grief once Lily's needs were met. He told Eleanor, haltingly at first, then more freely, about the family tree project, about the empty branch, about how helpless he'd felt standing in the rain watching his daughter decide that leaving something blank was better than facing what was missing. Lily, for her part, had quietly moved her chair closer to Eleanor's, and by the time the cafe's lights dimmed for closing, she was showing Eleanor how Mr. Tray Buttons could do a somersault off the edge of the table, laughing, actually laughing, a real, unguarded sound that Daniel hadn't heard from her in what felt like months. They didn't exchange numbers that first night. It felt too soon, too fragile, like naming the thing might scare it away. But the following Tuesday, almost without discussing it, Daniel found himself walking Lily past that same cafe after school again. And there was Eleanor, at the same table, facing the door, as if some small part of her had been hoping. This became their unspoken ritual. Every Tuesday, rain or shine, Daniel and Lily would stop at the cafe, and Eleanor would be there. She began bringing small things for Lily. A set of colored pencils one week, a secondhand book about rabbits the next, a paper bag of odd, mismatched buttons for a girl who clearly appreciates a good button. Lily started keeping a small notebook just for their Tuesdays, filling it with rabbits' drawings and pressed flowers Eleanor helped her find in the planter boxes outside. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it didn't stay simple for long. Word of the Tuesday visits eventually reached Ruth, Sarah's mother, during one of her regular weekend visits to see Lily. Ruth was a good woman, fiercely protective of her granddaughter in the particular way grandmothers become after losing a daughter of their own. And when Lily mentioned Eleanor's name for the third time in one afternoon, Eleanor said this. Eleanor showed me that Eleanor thinks rabbits are the best animal in the whole world. Ruth's face had tightened in a way Daniel recognized immediately. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, Ruth sat him down at his own kitchen table and asked, carefully, but pointedly, who exactly this woman was, how old she was, how they'd met, and why his daughter seemed to be forming an attachment to a stranger from a coffee shop. Daniel understood where the questions came from. Ruth had already lost her daughter, and the idea of her granddaughter growing close to yet another woman, who might, for any reason, disappear from her life, felt to her like a risk she couldn't bear to watch play out twice. She wasn't cruel about it, but she was direct. Children's hearts weren't things to experiment with, she said, and grief had a way of making lonely people cling too quickly to whoever showed them kindness. She asked him to slow down, to think it through, to consider whether he was making this decision for Lily's sake or for his own. Daniel didn't have a perfect answer that night, and he told Ruth so honestly. He admitted he'd asked himself the same question more than once, whether he was leaning on for Eleanor, because Lily needed her, or because he did. But he also told Ruth what he'd watched happen over 6 Tuesdays. A little girl, who used to leave school with her shoulders curled inward, now walked in humming. A family tree that used to have one branch was slowly, carefully, becoming something else. He wasn't rushing anything, he said. He was simply refusing to close a door that had, for the first time in 2 years, let some light back into their apartment. Ruth wasn't fully convinced that night, and she said as much before she left. But she agreed, reluctantly, to meet Eleanor herself before deciding what she thought. That meeting happened 2 Tuesdays later, arranged carefully, almost formally, at the same cafe table where everything had started. Ruth arrived early, sat stiffly, watched the door the way a person watches for trouble. But when Eleanor walked in, soft-spoken, unassuming, immediately kneeling to Lily's eye level to ask about a drawing, before she'd even taken off her coat, something in Ruth's posture began, slowly, to change. The two women talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. First cautiously, then with the particular ease of people who recognize a matching kind of sorrow in each other. Ruth learned about Emma. Eleanor learned about Sarah. By the time the cafe lights dimmed for closing, Ruth reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand, and told her, quietly, that she was grateful. Grateful that whatever force had put her granddaughter in this path, had known something Ruth hadn't been ready to see. There were hard weeks too, even after that. One Tuesday, Lily asked Eleanor, with the blunt honesty only children have, whether it made her sad to spend time with a kid who had a family when her own daughter didn't, and get to grow old and have one. Eleanor's eyes filled, and for a moment, Daniel worried he'd made a mistake letting this closeness form so quickly. Worried he'd built something on a foundation that couldn't hold two people's grief at once. But Eleanor took Lily's small hand in both of hers and said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. That loving a child again didn't erase the child she'd been. It just meant her heart had found room to keep growing, instead of closing up for good. She said Emma would have liked that her mother wasn't sitting alone anymore. She said maybe this was Emma's way of leaving a light on for her. Even with Ruth's blessing, Eleanor herself struggled more than she let on in those early weeks. One Tuesday, she didn't show up at all. Daniel and Lily sat at their usual table for nearly an hour. Lily glancing at the door every few minutes, before they finally accepted that the empty chair across from them was going to stay empty that night. Daniel found Eleanor's number and called, gently, asking only if she was all right. She admitted, after a long pause, that she'd sat in her car outside the cafe for 20 minutes and simply couldn't make herself walk in. She said she'd woken up that morning, gripped by a fear she couldn't fully explain. That the closer she let herself get to Lily, the more it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff she'd already fallen off once before. Loving Emma hadn't protected Emma. She didn't know, she admitted quietly, whether she had it in her to love someone that much again, and survive it a second time if life decided to be cruel twice. Daniel didn't try to talk her out of the fear. He simply told her that he understood it better than almost anyone, that he lived with a version of it every single day. The terror of loving someone as fiercely as he loved Lily in a world that had already proven it could take people without warning. He told her that the fear never fully went away, in his experience, but that the alternative, closing the door before anything could hurt you, had never once made grief smaller. It had only made the empty chair emptier. He asked her not to disappear, not for Lily's sake alone, but because in 8 short weeks she had become someone he and his daughter genuinely looked forward to seeing, and that mattered. Fear or no fear. Eleanor was quiet on the phone for a long moment. The following Tuesday, she was back at the table, facing the door, the way she always had been, except this time, Daniel noticed, she'd brought 2 rabbit-shaped cookies instead of 1. There was a harder moment still, weeks later, when Lily came down with a bad fever in the middle of the night, and Daniel, alone and panicking, found himself with no one else to call at 2 in the morning. Without hesitation, he called Eleanor, the number she'd finally given him weeks earlier, just in case. She arrived at his apartment in 20 minutes, still in her nightgown under a coat, carrying a bag of children's cold fever medicine and a battered paperback to read aloud until Lily fell back asleep. She stayed until sunrise, sitting in Daniel's kitchen while he dozed on the couch, exhausted and grateful in a way he didn't have words for. In the morning, when he apologized for the intrusion, for calling someone who technically owed his family nothing, Eleanor simply said that showing up for people you love was never an intrusion. It was the whole point. It was around then that Daniel realized what had actually happened over those months of Tuesdays. Eleanor hadn't just become a kind woman who liked his daughter. She had become family, the kind you don't choose by blood, but by every small, ordinary act of showing up, week after week, in the rain and out of it. And Lily, who had once drawn a family tree with a single lonely branch, had quietly, without anyone announcing it, started adding a new one. Months later, on a bright Tuesday that didn't need rain to feel special, Lily brought home a new family tree project from school. A different assignment, an updated version for the new term. This time, she didn't hesitate over the blank space. She drew her mother's branch first, careful and full of color, the way you honor someone you still love even after they're gone. Beside it, she drew her father's branch. And then, without asking anyone's permission, without hesitation, she added a third branch, small and slightly crooked, just the way Eleanor had drawn that first rabbit on a napkin. Underneath it, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she wrote one word: Eleanor, the lady who found us. When Daniel saw it, sitting at their usual table with Eleanor across from him and Lily between them, he understood something he hadn't seen. let himself believe in the 2 hardest years of his life. That family isn't only what you're born into, or what you lose. Sometimes it's what quietly finds you, one Tuesday at a time, in a cafe with fogged-up windows and string lights that make it feel like the inside of a snow globe. Sometimes the family you didn't know you needed is sitting at the next table over, nursing a cup of tea gone cold, waiting, without even fully knowing it, for someone small enough to remind her that her heart still had room to grow. Ruth was there too, that final Tuesday, sitting beside Eleanor now as easily as if she'd always belonged at that table. The 2 women who had each lost a daughter somehow finding, in each other and in one small girl's family tree, a version of family neither of them had expected to build again. Lily didn't know all the history behind the quiet look Ruth and Eleanor shared as she wrote Eleanor's name on that crooked 3rd branch. She only knew that the people at her table loved her, and that was enough. Eleanor never stopped missing Emma. Daniel never stopped missing Sarah. Grief, they both learned, doesn't get replaced. It gets carried alongside something new, until one day, the weight feels a little more like company, and a little less like a burden. Lily grew up with 2 mothers in her story. One she remembered through photographs, and her father's stories, and one who showed up, wet from the rain, with a napkin drawing of a rabbit, and simply chose to stay. If this story reminded you that the smallest acts of kindness can quietly rebuild a broken family, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one are exactly what we're here to tell. And there are so many more waiting for you. Sometimes cheering someone up isn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it's just a warm cafe, a rainy Tuesday, and being brave enough to let a stranger's kindness in. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next story.